March 12, 1945. The first light of dawn broke across the Pacific, casting a pale glow over the gates of a U.S. internment and POW camp in Hawaii. Engines rumbled as olive green buses pulled into the compound, their windows clouded with condensation. Inside, dozens of Japanese women sat in silence. Nurses from captured island garrisons, factory auxiliaries, and clerks swept up in the chaos of retreat. Each clutched a small bundle of belongings, the last fragments of the lives they had known. Their faces were taut with fear. For weeks, rumors had traveled with them like shadows, that Americans starved prisoners, that they exacted revenge for Pearl Harbor, that women would be humiliated. The clang of the gates only tightened the knot in their stomachs. Shoes scraped the dirt as the women were ordered to disembark. Some braced for blows, others whispered prayers. One nurse tightened her grip on a tattered medical satchel, as if the tools inside might shield her from what was coming. But what came was not brutality. It was order. The prisoners were led to a registration table beneath a fluttering American flag. Medical officers waited with clipboards, interpreters by their side. Each woman was logged, her name carefully recorded, her pulse checked. Thermometers and stethoscopes gleamed in the morning sun. The efficiency was disorienting. Instead of the chaos of capture, there was routine. Instead of fists, there were forms. A soldier gestured toward the barracks. Long wooden buildings with clean cots, thin but neatly folded blankets, and open windows to let in the breeze. The smell of food drifted from the mess hall, rice steaming in large pots, vegetables simmering in broth. A guard barked orders, but his tone was flat, not cruel. Women exchanged glances, their disbelief rising with the scent of the meal. They shuffled into line. Tin trays were filled with ladles of rice, beans, and even slices of bread. One woman, her hands trembling, lifted a spoonful of broth to her lips and whispered, "Is this captivity?" A companion shook her head in silence, eyes fixed on the bread, as if it were an illusion. Nearby, an American sergeant spoke quietly to another guard. "Here, everyone follows the rules. Geneva Convention, that's how it works." The words carried more weight than he realized. For the women who heard them, it was the first crack in the wall of fear. The camp moved with a rhythm designed not for cruelty, but for control. Barbed wire loomed above them, its shadow a constant reminder of their confinement. Yet within that boundary, there was structure. Food at set times, medical care under Red Cross supervision, guards drilled in procedure. To the women who had survived weeks of chaotic retreat through jungles and bombed-out ports, this was alien. They had expected degradation. Instead, they found order. Still, fear lingered. Each clink of a rifle sling reminded them that they were prisoners. Each shout in English confirmed their powerlessness. But as hours turned to days, the shock settled into a realization. Captivity might offer something they had not known for years: survival. The paradox was undeniable. Behind wire in a foreign land, they slept on clean cots, ate warm meals, and stood in line for medical checks. Back home in Japan, their sisters and mothers crouched in cellars during firebomb raids, clutching children as wooden homes collapsed in flames. In Tokyo, only hours before their arrival in Hawaii, more than 100,000 civilians had perished in a single night of bombing. The women could not see it, but they could feel it. The homeland was burning. As evening settled over the camp, the women lay in their bunks, staring at ceilings lined with beams. For the first time in weeks, they were not listening for planes overhead or shells in the distance. Yet rest did not come easily. The day had given them food and shelter, but also a haunting question. What did it mean when an enemy's prison offered more humanity than their own nation's war? The gates closed with a metallic echo, sealing them inside. Beyond the wire lay an uncertain future. Within it, an unsettling truth had begun to take shape. Captivity, paradoxically, might mean life. The camera pulls back from the wire fences of Hawaii and sweeps across the Pacific, back to the islands of Japan in the spring of 1945. There, the homeland was burning. On the night of March 9th, into the early hours of March 10th, Tokyo had become a furnace. Waves of American B, 29 bombers unleashed more than 1,600 tons of incendiaries over the capital. Wooden homes and narrow alleys became chimneys of flame. Entire neighborhoods disappeared in hours. By dawn, 100,000 civilians were dead, their bodies lying in blackened canals and smoldering streets. Survivors stumbled barefoot through rubble, their clothes singed their skin, carrying only what little they could save. This was not an isolated horror. Osaka, Nagoya, and Kobe lay under the same clouds of fire. In Osaka alone, nearly one-third of the city's population was rendered homeless within weeks. Industrial districts collapsed into ash. For women left behind, life was reduced to survival in ruins. Mothers crouched with children in air raid shelters, the roar of engines overhead never ceasing. Nurses worked by candlelight in overcrowded hospitals, wrapping wounds with scraps of cloth. Food was scarcer by the day. Official rations, meant to supply 1,500 calories, often fell below 1,200. Rice was mixed with millet or barley to stretch supplies. Some families lived on nothing more than sweet potatoes and watery soup. A factory worker in Nagoya wrote in her diary, "We count grains of rice, not bowls." Even tea became a luxury, replaced by roasted barley or grass. Coal shortages forced families to scavenge from demolished houses or burn scraps of furniture. Ash from fires settled on faces and laundry alike, a constant reminder that the war was consuming not just soldiers, but every home. Factories demanded endless labor, and women bore the brunt. Teenage girls, barely out of school, filled the ranks of the mobilized Student Volunteer Corps. They stitched parachutes, molded shells, and assembled aircraft parts in plants that shook as Allied raids thundered overhead. One girl recalled, "We sang to keep the fear away, but the walls rattled when bombs fell nearby. Our song broke into screams." For every hour spent at machines, another was spent digging through rubble, searching for neighbors, or dragging corpses to makeshift graves. Yet the war machine demanded more. Posters proclaimed duty to the emperor, urging women to sacrifice all for the nation. Factories hung slogans above assembly lines, "One plane more, one bomb more." But as the bombs rained down, those slogans rang hollow. Women worked until their hands bled, only to return to homes already destroyed. The contrast with women in captivity could not have been starker. Behind American barbed wire, Japanese prisoners received structured meals and slept without fear of firestorms. They stood for roll call instead of air raid sirens. They tended camp gardens instead of burying neighbors. In Hawaii and California, food meant rice, vegetables, bread, modest but steady. In Nagoya or Tokyo, food meant queues stretching for hours. Tin bowls held out for meager ladles of grain. The paradox sharpened with every day. The very women who had been captured, who believed they faced humiliation and death, were being preserved by the order of American camps. Meanwhile, those who remained free lived in terror and starvation. Freedom meant ashes. Captivity meant survival. By April, Japan's cities were shadows of themselves. Factories could not keep pace with demand. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Families scattered to the countryside, seeking food from exhausted relatives. Hunger became as deadly as bombs. Children fainted in classrooms, soldiers collapsed during drills, and mothers gave their last portions to infants. The homeland was unraveling. And though the women in American camps could not see the firestorms with their eyes, they sensed the collapse through letters, whispers, and the weight of silence from home. Each parcel of food they received, each bowl of rice in captivity, was a reminder of what others no longer had. It was within this backdrop of destruction that the paradox of captivity gained its sharpest edge. American order, rooted in the Geneva Convention, gave structure and sustenance. Japanese infrastructure, shredded by war, left even its loyal citizens in despair. The women behind wire began to realize that the true cruelty was not in their imprisonment, but in the collapse of the world they had once called free. Inside the sprawling camps of Hawaii, California, and the American Midwest, life for Japanese women prisoners began with something unexpected: routine. Each morning opened with roll call, the names of nurses, clerks, and auxiliaries called aloud against the backdrop of rising sun and rattling chain-link fences. What they had feared would be chaos, and humiliation became order. Meals arrived at set hours, supervised by both U.S. Army staff and Red Cross observers. Rice, vegetables, canned fruit, and even bread appeared on trays, a sight unthinkable in the ashes of Tokyo or Osaka. For the women who attended soldiers in tropical field hospitals, where wounds festered without quinine or penicillin, the sight of stocked infirmaries was nothing short of astonishing. Antibiotics, clean bandages, and sanitary wards turned their work from desperation into actual care. A nurse whispered to her companion, "This is the first time I have worked with enough medicine to treat everyone." Civilian clerks, once shadowed by the Kempeitai, Japan's feared military police, found a strange liberation within captivity. They were permitted to write censored letters, speak freely in dormitories, and even take part in English classes arranged by American chaplains. The irony was not lost on them. Under constant surveillance in their homeland, they now experienced more personal expression behind barbed wire. One clerk quietly remarked, "We are safer here than under our own skies." The guards who paced the perimeter towers carried rifles, but discipline was measured rather than brutal. Training, reinforced by the Geneva Convention of 1929, demanded restraint. Every action was scrutinized by Red Cross inspectors who toured the facilities, noting compliance with international law. The United States, eager to contrast its conduct with accounts of Batan's death march or the horrors of Changi prison, showcased its camps as proof of moral high ground. Cameras recorded inspections, and reports were filed to Geneva to broadcast humane treatment. Yet even within this atmosphere of order, contradictions pressed in. Letters home, each line reviewed and blacked out by censors, failed to bridge the widening gulf of experience. Mothers wrote about planting gardens or sewing uniforms inside the camp, but their families in Tokyo often received the letters too late or not at all. Some women stopped writing altogether, unable to reconcile their own sustenance with the knowledge of firebombs that rained down nightly on their neighborhoods. Dialogue at night revealed their private torment. "I dream of my children every night," a nurse confessed to her bunkmate. "But I also dream of fire, and I wonder, perhaps they are safer here with me, if only they could be." American order created a paradox too sharp to ignore. The very enemy they had been told would annihilate them was now their provider. Captivity delivered steady food, medical care, and protection. Freedom, in their homeland, meant exposure to annihilation, to the air raid, starvation, and collapse that defined life in Japan. Inside the camps, small communities blossomed. Sewing circles repaired uniforms and stitched makeshift garments from Red Cross cloth. Women organized language groups, teaching one another English words by lamplight. Guards watched but rarely interfered, aware that discipline was maintained more by routine than force. Still, guilt lingered at every meal, at every quiet night when sirens did not sound. Each bite of bread, each spoonful of rice was shadowed by the thought of loved ones crouched in burning neighborhoods. Women spoke in hushed tones, wondering if survival itself could become a kind of betrayal. The paradox of captivity deepened with every passing month. Behind the wire, the women lived within boundaries, but those boundaries gave them structure and the means to endure. Beyond the Pacific, Japan's boundaries were erased by bombs, hunger, and chaos. The chapter closed on an unspoken realization that spread among the prisoners. Captivity, once feared as the end of life, had become the means of preserving it. And so the question shifted, how could daily life behind barbed wire transform into a rhythm of survival? Each day inside the American camps unfolded with a cadence that soon became familiar. At dawn, the clang of a bell summoned women from their barracks for roll call. Names were read in crisp succession, the sound of boots pacing the gravel echoing to the still morning air. Guards checked their lists, and the women, wrapped in wool coats against the chill, answered with subdued voices. Then came the day's assignments. Some were sent to kitchens, their hands turning sacks of Red Cross flour into bread. Others worked in sewing rooms, patching uniforms or repairing blankets. A smaller group walked under guard in nearby fields, hoeing rows of crops in orderly silence. Meals were predictable, measured, and astonishingly steady. Rice arrived steaming in tin bowls, often accompanied by canned vegetables from American depots. Sometimes even bread or small portions of meat. Compared to the scorched earth hunger of Nagoya or the skeletal rations in Tokyo, these meals seemed abundant. The contrast lingered with every bite. A factory worker from Nagoya once whispered as she lifted her spoon, "Each bite tastes of betrayal." The others around her nodded, aware that their families might have gone to bed hungry that very night. Beyond the labor and meals, small communities blossomed. In the afternoons, women formed study groups, exchanging Japanese words for English ones written in chalk on scrap paper. Clerks taught basic arithmetic to younger internees. Nurses explained the importance of sanitation to children who played in makeshift schools marked by chalk lines on the dirt. Sewing circles stitched not only uniforms but also dolls from leftover cloth, bringing brief joy to the camp's younger faces. Gardens bloomed inside the fences, rows of vegetables tended with care, small reminders of home transplanted into captivity. The atmosphere carried contradictions too deep to ignore. Barbed wire hemmed them in. Towers loomed with armed guards, yet the absence of bomb sirens and the quiet order of camp life brought a strange sense of security. Many women admitted that behind the fences they felt safer than under Japan's skies, where Allied incendiaries reigned with merciless precision. At night, they could hear the steady hum of American generators and knew that no firestorm would rip through their barracks. Letters home were lifelines, but also burdens. Every word was reviewed, whole sentences blacked out in ink by military censors. "I am well," many wrote, though they longed to say more. Some stopped writing altogether, unwilling to describe meals they feared would sound like luxuries to starving relatives. Others wrote carefully, sparing details, knowing their families lived in ruins. One nurse confided to her bunkmate, "Even my silence is a kind of guilt." Still, moments of humanity pierced through the tension. Children laughed in makeshift classrooms. A guard once smuggled in a handful of candy, handing it discreetly to a young girl with shy eyes. Women sang familiar Japanese songs during the evenings, their voices rising softly over the wire as the sun sank behind the watchtowers. These small rhythms became the pulse of survival, each day turning captivity into something livable, if not entirely bearable. Yet the contradiction never left them. They were prisoners of an enemy they had been taught to fear, and yet the enemy fed them, sheltered them, and offered safety from war. Freedom, if it ever came, meant returning to bombed-out cities, and hunger. The paradox grew heavier with every roll call, every spoonful of rice, every night spent beneath quiet skies. Behind the routines and contradictions, a truth sharpened. Captivity had become a strange form of refuge. But beyond the wire, the war raged on, and soon the end would come, bringing not relief, but the dread of repatriation. The heat of August hung heavy in the air when the news finally reached the camps. At first it came in fragments, whispers carried by guards, headlines glimpsed in American newspapers, rumors too terrible to believe. Hiroshima had been destroyed by a single bomb, then Nagasaki. Within days, the voices on the radio confirmed it. Japan had surrendered. For the first time in history, the emperor himself spoke, his words distorted by static yet unmistakable. The women sat in silence, heads bowed, as the faint crackle announced that their homeland had laid down its arms. For those behind the barbed wire, the war's end should have meant liberation. Yet as the reality set in, the air filled not with joy but dread. They knew what awaited them beyond the Pacific. Cities reduced to ashes, ration lines that stretched for blocks, families scattered or lost. Freedom would return them not to home, but to ruin. American officers moved swiftly. Orders were read aloud, preparations made for repatriation ships. Women packed their few belongings into bundles. A Red Cross blanket, a pair of work shoes, a handful of letters that had survived the censor's ink. Farewells began quiet and unexpected. Guards who had once been symbols of fear now stood as steady constants, men who had enforced order without cruelty. A young nurse thanked a medic for bandages once freely given. Another woman pressed a folded origami bird into the hand of a guard, her gesture wordless but heavy with meaning. At night, the conversations grew hushed. Some admitted what they scarcely dared say aloud. They did not want to leave. Life in captivity had been predictable, structured. There was food every day, medicine for the sick, a roof overhead. One clerk murmured, "Here we had bread. There's only ash." Another added, "What freedom waits for us in ruins?" The fear was not abstract. Resistance women dreaded retribution. Their names, they knew, might still be listed in secret files back in Japan, marked by suspicion or betrayal. Nurses foresaw hospitals overflowing with patients but stripped of supplies. Factory workers anticipated returning to cities without factories, to labor without purpose. All understood that once the ships carried them back across the ocean, the small measure of security found in captivity would vanish. The paradox pressed on them with unbearable weight. They had feared capture more than death, had dreaded humiliation in enemy hands. Yet here, in the hands of their enemy, they had survived. And now, when the gates finally opened, many saw not liberation but punishment. The repatriation process unfolded with the same order that had defined their captivity. Trucks carried groups of women to ports, where ships waited under military supervision. The American officers explained the journey, their voices firm but not unkind. Each step was recorded. Each name ticked from the lists. For the women, the sound of boots on wooden planks as they boarded the vessels was not a march toward freedom, but a descent into uncertainty. As the ships pulled away, women crowded the decks, their eyes fixed on the receding shorelines of America. Some wept quietly, clutching keepsakes from their time in captivity. Others stood in silence, faces rigid, preparing themselves for what lay ahead. In their hearts, the contradiction burned. Captivity had given them order, food, and survival. Freedom would return them to hunger, chaos, and loss. The chapter closed with that haunting realization. The war was over, yet for these women, the hardest journey was only beginning. Ahead lay a homeland transformed beyond recognition, and with it, the cruelest irony of all, that captivity had shielded them more than freedom ever could. The ships that carried them home docked in silence, their decks lined with weary women staring toward a homeland they scarcely recognized. When the gangplanks dropped, what awaited was not the familiar rhythm of Japan, but the skeletal remains of a nation consumed by fire and war. Tokyo stretched out as a plain of rubble, its once bustling neighborhoods flattened into gray dust. Osaka stood as a burned-out husk of factories and homes, steel frames rising like charred bones against the horizon. The women stepped onto train platforms where glassless windows gaped like wounds. Some searched the crowds for loved ones, but saw only strangers, hollow-eyed from hunger. Families were missing, children orphaned, entire districts erased. Those who found relatives were met with tears and embraces, yet also with bitterness. Neighbors whispered accusations that captivity in America had spared them, that they had eaten while others starved. For women who had lived behind wire, survival itself became a source of shame. Food was scarcer than ever. The government ration of rice often amounted to little more than a handful, barely enough to sustain the body. Queues stretched for blocks, women clutching tin bowls and waiting under the gaze of occupation soldiers. A nurse who once treated POWs in Hawaii now stood in such a line, murmuring, "The Americans fed us better as prisoners in our own country does now." Her words carried the weight of unspoken truth, yet also the danger of betrayal. Black markets sprang up in the shadows. Sweet potatoes, barley, and scraps of coal changed hands for clothes, jewelry, or heirlooms. Women sold kimonos woven by their mothers for a few meals, traded wedding rings for medicine. Hospitals lay in ruins, stripped of supplies, their wards filled with malnourished patients and children coughing in the cold. Factory workers returned to twisted shells of buildings, machines destroyed or dismantled. Nurses improvised with rags for bandages, boiling water for antiseptic that no longer existed. Even the act of sheltering became desperate. Families huddled in cellars dug beneath ruins, trying to shield themselves from winter winds with planks and salvaged scraps. At night, the cities were silent, save for the cough of illness and the shuffle of tired feet. The women who had come back from America carried memories of cots, soup, and orderly routines. Now they faced the chaos of survival with little more than empty hands. The guilt pressed down with every step. Each bowl of soup they had eaten behind wire, each medical check they had received under the Geneva Convention, seemed like a cruel contrast to the starvation before them. They could not speak of it openly. To admit that captivity had been more humane than freedom at home was to risk being branded traitors, to deepen the resentment already directed their way. Silence became their shield, though within it the paradox gnawed at them. Some tried to rebuild. Sewing circles formed again, not in camp barracks, but in burned-out schools, women stitching together whatever fabric remained. Others planted gardens in rubble-filled plots, coaxing vegetables from soil still scarred by fire. Mothers took in orphans where they could, adding one more mouth to feed though they had nothing to spare. Amid the ruins, survival demanded both sacrifice and silence. The women carried within them a memory they could not erase. The strange, undeniable truth that barbed wire in America had offered them safety, food, and dignity, while freedom in their own homeland meant hunger, suspicion, and ruin. It was a truth they rarely spoke aloud, yet it lingered like a shadow in every ration line, in every makeshift shelter, in every bitter accusation from neighbors who had starved while they lived. And so, they began again in ashes, their past captivity both a shield against death and a burden of guilt. The paradox remained, unspoken yet unforgettable. Time passed, and the war became memory. Yet for the women who had once lived behind American barbed wire, that memory never fully released its grip. Decades later, their voices emerged in fragments, diaries preserved in family trunks, testimonies recorded in interviews, reports hidden in Red Cross archives. What they revealed was not triumph or simple survival, but a paradox that haunted them until the end of their lives. In the faded ink of letters never mailed, women described their disbelief at that first bowl of rice and bread offered by an American guard. Fear had dissolved into confusion, then into an uneasy gratitude. One nurse wrote that captivity had felt like a pause in the storm, a place where wounds could heal and hunger was eased, even as bombs rained down on her homeland. Another woman, once a clerk in Nagoya, recalled the silence of the camp library, a place where she could read without fear of air raids. For them, these moments of order and dignity became memories too sharp to speak of openly. Shame tempered every recollection. To admit that the enemy had treated them better than their own nation felt like betrayal. Many chose silence, carrying the paradox in private, rather than risk reproach from neighbors who had starved in the ruins of Osaka or perished in the firestorms of Tokyo. Some memoirs omit the details entirely, speaking only of a period abroad, while others bury the contradiction beneath layers of restraint. And yet, there were voices who dared to speak plainly. In interviews conducted years later, a former factory worker confessed that her time in captivity had given her the first full meals she had eaten since childhood. "I lived well," she whispered, "but I could never say so, not even to my children." Another woman admitted that the Geneva Convention's protections, inspections, medical care, the order of daily routines, had offered her a kind of security she never found again in post-war Japan. Her gratitude, though quiet, was unmistakable. The Red Cross archives confirmed these accounts. Inspectors reported women's camps stocked with food, monitored by American officers conscious of international law. These records stand in stark contrast to Japan's own desperate reports of famine, malnutrition, and social collapse in 1945. The irony deepens in hindsight. Women who had been prisoners of war survived on bread and vegetables, while free women in their homeland dug through ashes for scraps. The paradox becomes a lens through which their stories are remembered. Captivity had meant safety, food, and dignity. Freedom had meant ruin, hunger, and suspicion. Survivors lived with this contradiction as quietly as they could, but in their writings and their rare confessions, the truth lingers. Sometimes the enemy had shown them more humanity than their own nation could. The documentary closes where it began, with the image of arrival. The gates of an American camp creak open. Buses unload weary women, and fear grips every heart. Yet instead of cruelty, bowls of rice and bread are set before them. That moment, frozen in time, frames a contradiction that endured for the rest of their lives. There is no resolution, only reflection. War shattered loyalties, blurred the lines between captivity and survival, between freedom and destruction. For these women, the haunting truth remained. Survival had not come from the homeland they served, but from the unexpected order captivity in the hands of their enemy. And so the echo of their paradox carries forward, a reminder that in the total wars of the 20th century, humanity sometimes emerged not where one expected, but where one least believed it could be found.